Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. I'm here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Corporate and societal leadership traits is an ever-changing smorgasbord, and even more so now in this age of COVID. Our guest is the author, Dr. Karl Moore of McGill University, who is writing a book called Are All Ambiverts Now. He's going to tell us how we can change our perspective on introverts and extroverts, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Welcome, Dr. Moore.
My pleasure, Tony.
I guess first, what's the basic premise of your book?
Well, saying that in the past we thought almost all leaders were extroverts. That is kind of what people thought, and the literature said, but without a lot of evidence or actually a study of it. And the literature was largely written by psychology professors testing undergraduate students, which is great. As a professor, we have endless supplies of undergrads. But I was interested in senior leaders, men and women like yourself, Tony, who actually led for many, many years. How many were introverts? How many were extroverts? And when I looked at it, it turned out that it's a bell curve, which is the normal population, that about 40% of leaders are extroverts, 40% are introverts, and about 20% were what we call ambiverts. Now, ambiverts may be a new term for many of your listeners. And it goes back to the 20s in the US. A psychology professor invented the term, but it largely disappeared for the last 60, 70 years until a guy named Adam Grant, who's a rock star professor at Wharton, did a research study about 10 years ago. And now I'm popularizing the term. And it's saying is that senior leaders have got to act like an introvert at times and extrovert at other times. And that's what an ambivert is, someone who can act like an introvert at times and extrovert at other times. Now, a key point, Tony, is that about 40% of people like me are extroverts. I'm an extreme extrovert. About 40% of senior leaders are introverts. But it's saying that to be an effective leader, you've got to learn to act like the other because the circumstance calls for it.
Now, maybe just help our audience and make sure we're on the same page. Definitions a little bit, introvert, extrovert, to start with.
So the central idea, it's not about shyness. It's about your response to stimulation. Introverts love people, love being with people, but at a certain point, if they get too much stimulation, they kind of tilt over and go, enough of this. I need to take an introvert break, be by myself, be quiet to recharge. Now, it's interesting because extroverts love stimulation. And at a certain point, if they spend too much time, so I'm sitting in my office here, I'm writing a book on introverts, ironically, and after a couple of hours, I can't take it anymore. Tony, do you hear the pain in my voice? I've got to go downstairs to the second floor. There was an endless supply of undergrads, albeit I'm teaching, giving grades to, that are happy to see me. And in fact, they've heard this lecture sometimes. They tease me and go, extrovert break? Yeah. But I need to recharge my batteries because I've been alone too long. I've missed the stimulation of being with people, being in a circumstance which lights me up. Right. So I take extrovert breaks as a result. So it's about stimulation. Now, there's an interesting study at Harvard done a number of years ago where they looked at 4-month-old babies and they tested their response to stimulation and then they followed them for decades. And it was a reasonably strong predictor of whether you'd be introverted or extroverted as an adult as a 4-month-old baby, which suggests it's part of our hardwiring, at least to some degree.
Now, I guess not everyone is 100% introvert or 100% extrovert, right?
No, I mean, it's a bell curve where I'm an extreme extrovert, but there's people who are a bit extroverted, people who are a bit introverted. And it's one trait of a very complex human being. And so, Tony, we could say that you're an extrovert or introvert, but you're also a man. You're, if I might, over 50. You're a former politician, a leader. If we asked your family, they'd say, boy, Tony's so much more complex than those few descriptors. So it's something we recognize the complexity of human beings. And I'm overly excited about this topic as I'm studying it, but it's an interesting way to look at people that can help me work more effectively with them. But there's a lot of other things I've got to consider as well.
We've got about 30 seconds before the break. We'll probably have to continue this discussion after, but just start us on why ambiverts are better. What makes them a better mix?
Well, they're not better. What I'm saying is it's part of our hardwiring, so it's all fine. God made us that way, if you would. But it's saying that as an extrovert, I need to act like an introvert at times to be an effective leader. And if you're an introvert, you have to act like an extrovert at times to be an effective leader. Now, if you don't want to be a leader, that's fine. But I'm saying if you want to be a leader based on 450 interviews, you need to act like an ambivert, but recognize who and what you are naturally.
We're going to come back to this topic right after the break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, talking with Dr. Karl Moore, McGill University. He's writing a book called We Are All Ambiverts Now. Karl, again, really interested in the leadership qualities possibly required. I mean, I think you're saying that we all have little bits and pieces of extroversion or introversion here, but ambiverts, you say that in certain situations it's better for them to switch on the other trait for leadership purposes. Do you have some leadership examples where that would be helpful?
Sure. What I'm arguing, Tony, is that as an extrovert, I need to act like an introvert, and an introvert on occasion as a leader would have to act like an extrovert. Now, ambiverts do this naturally. I've got to do it and take care. For example, David Benson, who runs Aldo, he's the son of David, Aldo. He's 6'7", he's big, he's not overweight, he's just a large man, he's CEO. So we recognize if he goes to a conference room to discuss strategy and he tells people what's on his mind, it's going to tend to a quiet conversation. People go, that's why you're the CEO. I love it. So David would, though he's an extrovert, would not tell them what is on his mind because he knows what's on his mind. What he wants to know is on what are other people's minds. And so he pulls back from, being the natural extrovert and listens as a good introvert would and gets other people's opinion. Because at the end, what's in his mind in terms of strategy has evolved from the conversation around the table, and they'll come to a better strategy. Now, happy thought, he's still CEO, so he gets to decide the strategy, but it's improved because he acted like an introvert and really listened well and connected the dots to what people were saying. So he's got to show introverted behavior to be effective. On the other hand, Claude Mongeau used to run CN, 24,000 people. And he was the first CEO that I talked to that I asked the question. And Claude said, I'm a big introvert. And it's something where Claude had to act like an extrovert if he wanted to be CEO. Right. So he was COO for a number of years. And he got a coach that gave him a clicker like someone let you in a bar would. And it's been such a long pandemic, I can't remember what they call him, a bouncer. Tony, that's what they call him. And he had to click 5 times a day and act like an extrovert in order to grow into that role. So, for example, you get in the elevator in the morning, and instead of looking at his shoes and saving us a couple $100,000, he'd go, "Good morning, Tony." He recognizes you, says your name, and says something like, "Hey, it's cold out there," something you're not going to argue with in Montreal in the winter. And then, "Tony, I love what you presented to the board last week. That was really helpful." Get off the elevator. Because we expect a CEO to act like that, to remember my name, to recognize what I've done, and say something positive towards me. That's good senior leader behavior. So as an introvert, he had to do something which is a bit unnatural, right, but he recognized the value of doing it.
The reason I'm smiling is because I actually made it a New Year's resolution, I think it was in 2018 or somewhere in there, to actually go in random elevators and strike up conversations with people, which sometimes worked. Sometimes people looked at me rather oddly, I must say. But
so are you more of an introvert or an extrovert, Tony, just to get personal for a moment?
Yeah, I would say I'm more of an introvert in the sense that I don't mind my own company. I don't mind switching off. But I had to, in politics, be an extrovert. When you're knocking on doors of strangers and asking for their vote, that's a fairly extreme form of extroversion. So again, in order to survive in my milieu, I had to switch things on. But I remember, like, when we were going to party conferences or things like that, my staff knew that I had a set amount of people that I could talk to, and when I reached that point, they had to usher me out of the hall because I'd start to be annoyed and want to be alone with myself a little bit. So that's kind of how I self-analyze. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I interviewed Justin Trudeau, who I know when he just graduated from McGill when I came here, so I did a few things with him. I wish I'd known he'd be prime minister. I would have been friendlier, but anyway, he's a great guy. And he told me he was an introvert. And when I interviewed him for my radio show, and I actually rolled my eyes, I think I knew him well enough, and I was genuinely surprised. But he said he's genuinely an introvert, but he understood if he wanted to be in politics and become potentially prime minister, which he did. I mean, his dad was the prime minister. He's someone who knew what he was getting into. Now, he's going to make the world a better place and so on, but he had to act a certain role, and he knew what that role was. He took it on willingly, but he still needs those introvert breaks to recharge like you do. Now, there's an interesting thing because I read about introvert breaks, but there was nothing about extrovert breaks. And I said, well, that's unfair. How come they get breaks when we don't? So I wrote an article for the Warden Leadership Digest arguing there's 5 types of extrovert breaks that I take. And it really resonated with a lot of people, well, with extroverts anyway, because they said, yeah, I take those breaks. So, for example, when I go to a restaurant in
Karl,
another city.
we're going to take another break. Talking about breaks, we have to take one right now. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, having a great conversation with Dr. Karl Moore, associated with McGill University, amongst other accolades. And he's writing a book about introverts and extroverts called We Are All Ambiverts Now. I had to cut you off there because we had to take a break, but please talk more about these breaks for introverts and extroverts.
Well, there's introvert breaks, but there's not much extrovert breaks. So I reflected as an extrovert, I take breaks. So talk about going down, seeing my students when writing a book, or when I travel with my wife and kids, I will go sit at the bar. Instead of sitting with a book, reading at a table, like a lot of introverts will do and love doing, I will go sit at the bar and talk to total strangers and strike up a conversation. So I was in New York recently, and I sat at the bar, and I just said to people, "Hi, I'm from Montreal. I'm a professor at McGill, and my wife and kids aren't here, so I thought I'd sit at the bar and talk to native New Yorkers." So everybody seemed pretty relaxed with that kind of approach. And then I talk to people, and it's stimulating, and I get energy from it. So that recharges my battery so that I can go be in the hotel room by myself and watch Netflix or whatever.
Now, of course, COVID has been called the great break for introverts because we were in lockdown. We didn't have to associate with other people, and to the same extent, we had a Zoom call here or there. Can you talk to a little bit about COVID and shining a spotlight a little bit on these issues?
Well, I wrote a piece for my Forbes blog 10 days into it going, I'm an extrovert. I can't take it anymore. That was 10 days in. So you can imagine almost 2 years later. And I'm down at McGill here in my office, partly because my wife teaches grade 5, my kids are in university, and so I'm too noisy at home. But I come downtown Montreal, there's fewer people than normal, but I run into people I know, and we stand with masks on at a socially safe distance, but it's stimulating to run into people. It's great to be in the classroom. We're all wearing masks, but it's stimulating because there's a back and forth that you don't get on Zoom. Right. So it's something where I seek out that because it was really tough. Now, one of the things I did in our neighborhood, we're across from a small park. I arranged every second Friday for a while to meet for an adult beverage in front of David and Marion's house. And the kids could go in the park and we could sit at a safe distance in a lawn chair and have a drink of your choice. But it was great because we were all a bit lonely. Instead of going to work or whatever, even the introverts going, it's a bit much. And so we could talk to neighbors, got to know them, and the neighborhood got more friendly because we had no one else to talk to for a while. It's tough on extroverts, but even introverts at a certain point go, enough of this, we need human contact, which is a base human need.
Right, yeah. So even introverts at some point think that this is an unnatural state, in other words, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Obviously, what we've been talking about is sort of corporate and political leadership and the leadership skills you need to succeed. Does this have wider ramifications on how society is ordered, do you think?
Well, something where you think about high school students or my undergraduates when I'm teaching them, that I've tried to make room for the introverts. So, for example, maybe not the whole class discussing because it's too much on them, but in groups of 2 or 3, they're more comfortable. Plus, I would send them ahead of time some questions. So we have the head of the most senior general in Canada coming to class next week. So I've asked students for questions, and he wanted particularly questions from the students. So I give them several days to think about it instead of on the spot. Now, I could sit down there and have a conversation on the spot as an extrovert, and there's a certain charm that I'm making it up, and you can get on thin ice that way. But the introvert wants to think it through, do a bit of research, so I give them the opportunity to do that, so they're better to ask questions in class. So I co-create each class that we have a guest with a student, but I give them some days to work on it, and it makes the introverts more comfortable. And the extroverts do it as well, but they don't probably spend as much time. They'll make it up a little bit as it happens.
It's very interesting because what I see you doing is coming up with a way to build some of these skills. You practice it yourself, going to the bar or strike up at conversations. Should we as a society be more serious about building up these skills?
Well, something where Susan Cain, a colleague of mine, wrote a book called Quiet years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, and got a huge, huge response. And that's what set me off on this research, honestly, was her book. And what we recognized is that we need to make room for introverts in society, not only as leaders, but as neighbors and friends and family members. And we recognize that this is their hardwiring. This is the way that they were made. Give them some room to do better and make room for them. So if I have introverts working for me, which I always do, some of my people, in a meeting, I don't call them right away, but I'll look them in the eye and I'm saying, Tony, are you ready to speak? And you'll go or nod your head. And then I'll call on you if you say yes. But if you say, no, I'm not going to call on you.
Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust having a great conversation with Dr. Karl Moore of McGill University, who's writing a very interesting book called Are All Ambiverts Now. First of all, before I ask another question, where can we learn more? You got a podcast, I believe, and some other things going on?
Well, I have a radio show, CEO series, where I interview CEOs. So I do about 50 a year. But there's some articles, if you Google my name and introverts or extroverts or ambiverts on the web, the advantage of having an odd name like Karl with a K and Moore with 2 O's is there's only relatively few of us in the world. So if you Google me, it'll come up. Click if you add McGill, and you'll find a bunch of the articles that I've written about this. And, it's got press coverage in The Economist last year, The Guardian, the Mail on Sunday's coming out, I think next Sunday, an article on it. So there's a bunch of stuff that's out there, partly because this is a topic the whole world cares about, because everybody is one of the three. There's also a cultural overlay, Tony, that it moves to the left or right depending on the culture you're in. So I lived in England for 5 years, taught at Oxford, and I got a British accent. When I go to England, I have a British accent, I'm more sarcastic, and I'm quieter. Now, I myself in Montreal and Toronto, where I grew up, or Regina lived for a couple of years, when I go to New York, and my students don't believe this, I absolutely turn up the volume, which they find hard to fathom. But you've been in New York, Tony. It's just a noisy place, and you got to turn up the volume a bit to be heard. So I adjust my personality for the cultural I am in, albeit the UK, Canada, and the US are some of the closer cultures in the world. But it's also, I took students to Tokyo and Bangkok just before the pandemic. Our theory was, and McGill has an MBA in Tokyo, so I've been there quite a bit, is that it's the same bell curve, but it goes more introverted in Japan.
Right.
More extroverted in Thailand. We asked a bunch of CEOs we met with and other people, and they agreed that there's extroverted Japanese, but by and large, a bit more introverted as a culture, and there's introverted Thais. We met some, but it's a bit more extroverted culture. So we adjust to the culture as well, which is interesting because Toronto would probably be a bit more American, a bit noisier, a bit more extroverted. But we have people immigrating to Toronto from around the world. And so you have got to adjust a bit to be Canadian.
That's a very interesting point. I guess my next question is about the mental wellness aspects of this, because I think what you're studying, if people know themselves better and know how to cope with and project what they want to project, it is a mental wellness boon for that person. Is that something that you have thought about?
Yeah, I mean, it's something where during the pandemic, my wife's an introvert, I'm an extrovert, and we both reflected on, and she teaches grade 5. So other than a couple days here in Quebec, she was with the students. She comes home, we live close to school, for lunch to take an introvert break. And I remember a couple of months ago on Friday, we went to a local Japanese pub, which is very noisy. They do sake bombs, and there's a lot of yelling. On Friday night, it was just too much for her. Saturday night, fine, but Friday night after a long week with grade 5 kids, where I loved it, but I realized it was the wrong place for her, and we're never going back there again on a Friday night because it's just not what she needs. So if we understand ourselves and others, we can kind of lean in a bit to make their lives a little bit more fitting with their personality type.
And do you think that knowing you, if one knows oneself better, after reading your book, let's say, that'll make a positive difference in their lives?
Oh, absolutely. As an extreme extrovert, I recognize my needs, but I also recognize that it's a weakness and sometimes. And it's interesting, probably around grade 3, you lose your name, Tony. If you have a kid in grade 3, you're no longer Eric's father, or Karl, you're Eric's father. And if you get upset about the other parents, grow up. Your kid's more important in this context. And there's a time as a cabinet minister, you had to point out to the ADM that they did a great job, that their ideas what you took to the cabinet, and you were happy to do that. But you praise them because if it's all about you, people go, Tony should grow up. There's a point as you come older and more of a senior leader that you have enough attention, you want to deflect it to other people because that's the mature thing to do.
This has been a really interesting discussion. I want to thank you, Karl, Dr. Karl Moore, McGill, for a really interesting discussion on introverts, extroverts, and ambiverts. We're looking forward to your book being published. Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure, Tony.
Interesting discussion with Dr. Karl Moore about introverts, extroverts, and ambiverts. Really a way to look at leadership in the corporate sector, the political sector, how to arrange society better. Lots of interesting thoughts there. And yeah, I could tell he was an extrovert. He helped carry the conversation. I hope you enjoyed it too. We'll see you next time.